National RTAP webinar, Moving from Demand Response to Deviated Fixed Route Service. Oops, I'm sorry. If I could, I have another staff person, if they could start the recording, that would be great. Before we start with the presenters, I do have a poll that I would like to have people respond to. And it's just going to take me a second to launch it. We just want to find out where you are as it relates to the service that you're providing, whether it's demand response, whether you're doing demand response and contemplating deviated route, and whether you're doing deviated route, or if you're providing fixed route and contemplating deviated route. I'm going to leave the poll open for maybe another minute. We have about 44% voting so far, 50, it's going up. And then what I'll do is I'll display the poll on the screen. And it looks like they're still coming in. I have another person here that's helping me out called Liz, so every once in a while I may ask for Liz's assistance.
Hi, everyone.
That's Liz. Okay, I think there's still people answering. Liz, if I were to display this, how would I do that?
You have to close the poll, and then you will have the option to share the results.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think that we're there. Okay, and I believe you can see the results now. The 15% provide demand response service, 20% provide demand response but contemplating deviated route, 25% provide deviated route fixed route service, and 7% provide fixed route and contemplating deviated route. So it's a nice mixture of folks, especially those that are interested in maybe contemplating deviated route. Okay, and thank you very much for answering our poll. Okay, today we have 3 panelists, our presenters, that will be talking about deviated route. Our first presenter is Julie Schafer. She's a senior associate with RLS Associates. Julie has 19 years experience in the transit industry. She's joined RLS Associates after a successful career with an area agency on aging in Southeast Indiana. Ms. Schafer had a lead role in the development of and then managed a 7-county public transportation system. Julie's role in the development of the public transportation system included needs assessment, system design, grant writing, local fund development, branding, and marketing. Julie has considerable expertise in state and federal compliance, grant writing, resource development, data analysis, and policies and procedures. As RLS resident rural transit circuit rider, she works with transit systems in several states: Ohio, Indiana, New Hampshire, Nevada, North Carolina, and West Virginia, to strengthen administrative and operating practices, evaluate, enhance, and improve services, and identify, document, and solve administrative and operating issues. Our second presenter is Angie Peters. She's is the Union County Public Transit Manager with the Northeast Oregon Public Transit under Community Connection of Northeast Oregon, Inc. She manages operations for public transportation as well as non-emergency medical transportation, including Rise to Wellness in Union County. She serves on the Northeast Area Commission on Transportation with Oregon Department of Transportation and on the Oregon Public Transportation Advisory Council's ADA workshop. And our third presenter is Frank Thomas. Frank is the Region 5 Coordinator of Rail and Public Transit for Oregon DOT. He's certified community transit manager and a graduate of the Paratransit Transit Management Program of the and I should know this, my last name is Tassinari, Graziadio School of Business Management at Pepperdine University. He is the regional coordinator for Oregon Department of Transportation's 5th region, the 8 rural counties, and which means that he oversees 8 rural counties and 2 tribals, comprising the eastern third of the state. He serves on the National Rural Transportation Assistance Program Review Board, and Frank is in, 23 years in the rural public transportation industry. Julie Schafer is our first presenter, and just a little bit of background. National RTAP did some technical assistance in 2015, 2016, and one of the projects was to provide an evaluation of service in Wabash, Indiana. And what Julie was the consultant that worked on the project for National RTAP. So Julie will give you some insight from that, as well as some recommendations on deviated route. And I am just switching the screen over to Julie. So be patient. Okay. All set, Julie.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. As Rob mentioned, I did work on the Wabash, Indiana project for National RTAP. And as a little bit of background for the Wabash, Indiana system, they are a one-county rural public transit system naturally in Wabash County, Indiana. But they had some challenges that had faced them that led them to apply for the project with National RTAP. Some of those challenges were new political leaders that were really putting some pressure on for them to change the service design, with the primary focus that some of the new leaders wanted to see was a trolley system within the downtown Wabash area, and not so much service to the county. They wanted more focus on a city service and focus more on tourism elements. The other factor that was a major concern was that they lost some funding with they had New Freedom funding that they were providing transportation to out-of-county services, and Indiana made the New Freedom funding when it got combined in with the 5310 program for capital purchases only. So they discontinued their out-of-county service, which impacted their trips and performance data considerably. So that is a little bit of background as far as why they wanted a service evaluation. I will say, too, that we did not go into the service evaluation knowing the answers. Actually, a deviated route service was not one of the initial considerations, being that this is a small community without a lot of population concentrations. However, we will discuss, or I will discuss, the reason that we moved towards the deviated route service. Okay. As you can see, the population for Wabash County is just slightly over 32,000, with 2 major population centers, the city of Wabash and the community of North Manchester, which comprises 50% of the entire county's population. The goal was to create more effective and efficient transportation. Again, the performance that Wabash County was realizing was decreasing. They actually went from slightly over 40,000 trips down to not even 30,000 trips over a 3-year period. They were operating 9 peak fleet vehicles, but one of the surprising things that we discovered is that they were serving only 112 unduplicated customers within that community. So out of the 30,000 plus individuals there, 112 individuals were getting 100% of the service. The trips per service hour were 1.75 trips per service hour, which is not very good if you look at the National Transit Database, and we also did compare Wabash County to all of their Indiana peers. They were one of the worst performing systems within the state. I believe there was only one other that actually had lower trips per service hour. So some of the things that we wanted to look at as far as planning and making sure that we did do recommendations for a service that would, in fact, increase those performance indicators and more efficient and effective for the community, were the actual economic and demographic status, the population trends, which the population trend in Wabash County was their population is declining and is anticipated to still continue to decline. However, the populations within the city of Wabash and North Manchester are anticipated to maintain or even slightly increase for North Manchester. Population by age, the employment and income status of the community, the density of households that are actually below poverty income, zero vehicle households, and the industry and labor force, and where the industry and labor force was located, as well as what type of jobs those were. Okay. We also then did some transit propensity mapping, okay, which took those factors into consideration. So this next map here is the results of that. So you will see that there is really only one area of very high concentration for transit propensity, which transit propensity is the concentration of individuals that are likely to use transportation services, which that red area there that you see is actually located all within the Wabash city limits, and the surrounding area there off to the left is also within the corporation limits. For almost all of it's within the corporation limits for the city of Wabash. The other area up to the top of your screen and slightly to the right is the community of North Manchester. Okay. The community of North Manchester has a university and a grocery store, a couple medical facilities, but other than that, most of the individuals in North Manchester are relying on the services within the city of Wabash or within those corporation limits for grocery shopping, medical appointments, and all the social service offices are all located within the city of Manchester. Okay. So looking at the transit propensity, we thought, okay, obviously these two communities have the highest potential for transit need. As you see, there is a lot of the dark green area, which is a very low propensity, and then we have a couple other outlying areas that also have a moderate transit need. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that we also went into this project with, we don't want to change just for the sake of changing. There needs to be a reason for change, and we need to make sure that whatever changes we are proposing, we have all the information and have analyzed things well so that we know that the change will be an improvement. Okay. So we don't want to set ourselves up for failure. So we want to make sure that we do gather the information and closely analyze the information before making any decisions. Okay. So as far as some of the information that we wanted to look at trip data. This information happens to be June of 2015 trips. We did look at more than just 1 month. The information for Wabash County Transit was relatively easy to get because they were using Route Match scheduling software. So all of their trips we had all the GIS information to plot those trips. But if you look at where the trips were occurring, they are occurring within the city of Wabash and to and from North Manchester. So this was very telling information for us, which was one of the first indications that maybe a deviated route service would be a better mode of transportation instead of a 100% demand response service. Again, the trip data showed that the majority of the trips were actually occurring with both trip origination and destination within the city of Wabash. And there was considerable travel, especially at certain times of the day, 9 a.m., 1 p.m., and 3 p.m., to and from the city or the town of North Manchester. So we were able to extrapolate that information from the scheduling software. It is possible to do that even if you are doing manual scheduling. It's a little more challenging, but if you are using automated scheduling and dispatch software, this type of information is quite easy to generate. So we had several public meetings, and we had a group of interested stakeholders, which was an active group and a fairly large group. So we took this information to them and presented it first, and then we also generated a survey. On the community survey, we asked about preferred modes of transportation, and we tried to target individuals that were not currently using the transportation service but may be in need of the service. We also made sure that we did target the existing riders to get their input. And we were very clear in the definition for the different modes of transportation service. To make sure that we were clear on the mode of transportation for explaining what a deviated route service was, we actually posed the question back to our stakeholder group based upon the definition, what did they think that we meant by that. So luckily, they said that, well, it looks like, based upon this definition, that we are going to have a regular public transit route within the community, but it's not limited to just those stops. We can call and get picked up at other locations. So we felt fairly confident that we had described that deviated route service. We did receive a lot of surveys. I believe we received over 400 surveys back from the community. Most of them, again, were from residents within the city of Wabash, and almost exclusively, the response was that they wanted to see a deviated route service. So that is when we started moving towards actually designing a deviated route service. Okay. I would like to point out at this time that we also wanted to consider whether there would be both types of service operating within that community. Okay, whether we would still continue to offer demand response service in addition to the deviated route service, My recommendation to the group at that point was that there would need to be a very strong incentive to encourage individuals to use the deviated route service if they were going to, in essence, duplicate service within the area and offer both types of service. I think it's only natural if someone can get catered to service, be picked up at their home and taken directly to their destination for the same cost, that they are going to select that type of service. However, what we saw in Wabash County was that they were operating 6 vehicles within the city of Wabash, and those vehicles oftentimes were within a few blocks of each other at the same time. So they were catering to the needs of the 112 individuals, but not being very effective to do that. The other 3 vehicles were doing basically the same thing within the Wabash area, or the North Manchester area. And oftentimes, because it is about a little over a half-hour drive time from city of Wabash to the North Manchester area, those vehicles were sitting, waiting for the individual for return, sometimes 2 to 3 hours. So that vehicle was idle for that period of time. So those are all, like I said, considerations that were taken into account when we decided that deviated route service would be the most appropriate service to offer for within the Wabash County. Another thing that I do want to mention as far as when gathering data for deviated route services, looking at the existing trip platform that you have. As it turns out, over 50% of the trips that were occurring already within Wabash County were what we call subscription trips or automatically recurring trips. So that was a natural platform then for the rider base to build a deviated route schedule around. We didn't have to start out knowing that we may not have any riders because we had the opportunity to take the subscription route riders and go ahead and plot them and build deviated route service around those existing trips. About 90% of the trips were actually occurring within the city of Wabash, with the other 10% occurring in North Manchester, and maybe 8% occurring within North Manchester, and 2% within the outside county areas. However, when trips were being denied, they were also being denied in the outlying county areas because the vehicles were tied up already in the 2 major trip areas. In discussing trip generators, okay, naturally this is not an exhaustive list of trip generators, but again, typical to the other geography of the community, the medical facilities, stores, and all the human service agencies, recreational activities, and employment centers were located within these 2 major communities also, primarily in the city of Wabash area. There are, as I mentioned, a university in North Manchester and a couple medical facilities and 1 smaller grocery store, but other than that, the areas are pretty limited. North Manchester is unique also in that it has a large aging in place community. So it has a very large campus of condos, townhouses, all the way up then that you age into the assisted living and skilled nursing care facility. However, that group of individuals was not utilizing the Wabash transit services. They had their own vehicle that would provide service to them when needed. So you want to make sure that you know where your major trip generators are, and that your whatever service route that you design is going to incorporate the availability for individuals to actually get to those facilities. Okay. Other things that you want to consider are your actual service area size. Okay. Again, if you're looking at a deviated route service in lieu of a demand responsive service, if based upon your area size, someone is going to have to ride on the vehicle for 2 hours on a deviated route service to get to where they need, that is not going to be a very attractive service for them to use, and the likelihood of them using it on a regular basis is not high. Typically, demand response service is the, like I said, just the door-to-door or curb-to-curb service. Within the Wabash County service, oftentimes there were no more than 2 people on the vehicle at a time, oftentimes only 1 person. With the deviated route service, you are going to be having a more shared ride service, hopefully with a minimum of 4 people on board within the service hour, up to in a community this size, we would like to see actual ridership possibly up to 7 trips per service hour. But you need to be, again, realistic in the service area that you are designing the route within, and making sure that you have the appropriate number of vehicles to cover the service area. Okay. You also want to look at your roadway network. Okay. Do you have enough connecting roads, major highways, that type of thing? And also your population densities, which we definitely looked at in this area. Your travel constraints are something that you also need to be very in tune to. If you have railroad crossings, if you're going to establish a deviated route service with regular pickup times at checkpoint locations, then you need to know when those trains are coming through and adjust your schedule to meet those needs, or otherwise your customers are going to be frustrated quickly with your on-time performance. Another thing that I would like to mention before I move on to this slide is that when you're building your deviated route service, it is also very important that you build time in for the deviations, that you do not have an exorbitant amount of what I call checkpoint locations, or the fixed stops that you're going to be making. And also you want to make sure that your fixed stops, or the stops that you are making, are not driven by political influences or business influences in the community. Naturally, everyone is going to want their business or their apartment complex to be one of your normal stops. That is not realistic, in that you cannot incorporate all of those stops in and be effective and time efficient. So you want to make sure that you are using your data to make sure that the stops that you are making are true stops will be boarding the vehicle, that there is a high need for transportation in those areas. Okay. You may also need to consider limiting the number of deviations that you can do in between each stop. You don't want to take an unlimited number of deviations again and then truly mess up your on-time performance. So those are all things to consider when you are developing a deviated route service. Okay. Again, the goals that we set for Wabash County were we wanted to increase that trips per service hour from the 1.75 trips per service hour up to 4.5. which based upon the survey results and the transit propensity information was achievable. We wanted to reduce impact on no-shows, which they were having a lot of no-shows, but if someone knew that the vehicle was running along that route, the likelihood that they had not missed the bus, they could catch the bus in the next hour if need be, was great. Was going to be improved on-time performance with the regular route service, a reduction in revenue miles, because we're only now going to have, with this route design, 4 vehicles operating within the service area instead of the total of 9 that we're operating, and which would allow then the excess fleet that was no longer being absorbed in the same area to provide the countywide service and then investigate the possibility of providing the out-of-county service again if we could find the funding source to do so. Just kind of recap of the key considerations here. We want to make sure that your whatever service mode that you select, in this case the deviated route service, that it is driven by planning and the data analysis that you're doing. Make sure that the community is involved for the development, and you want to make sure that whatever survey that you put out there, it is specific to the information that you are trying to gather. So make sure that you have clear definitions, that you're asking the appropriate questions. And then for route design considerations, make sure that you are not designing the route based upon business or political influence, and it must be driven by the trip data and the research that you have conducted. Another very important element with this design of service and any new service is marketing the service. This was a very important piece for Wabash County, again, because we said we are only serving 112 individuals within the 30-some thousand in the community. So we needed to make sure that others in the community knew that the service was there, that it existed, and that it was open and available to everyone, and that it also was going to be convenient, that they did not have to call in the 48 hours in advance. The service would be available to them same day as they needed it, and if they chose to do so, they could walk to one of the stops and get on, or they could call and have curb-to-curb service to their home. So we made sure that we had a marketing plan, which involving the community and some of the major players, some of the major stakeholders, the medical facilities, and the organizations who had transit-dependent individuals, made sure that they are involved. And then marketing needed to start before the actual system startup, so that we didn't have that lag time of 2 to 3, possibly 6 months of marketing after the fact to try to build the ridership. We needed to get the marketing and the word out there of the grand opening and when the service was going to start. And then also the need for ongoing marketing to continue to raise the community awareness of the service being in existence. It's also very critical to any type of service that you evaluate on an ongoing basis your service, and to set some performance goals. Need to be realistic and achieved. Those goals need to be achievable. Okay? The goals should also evolve over time. Okay? Where so the initial goal for this was that we wanted to build within the first year the ridership up to the 4.5 trips per service hour. The goal for year 3 may be actually getting that up to 6 or 7 trips per service hour. The thing is, don't be so stringent when you're developing a service that you won't make needed modifications. You will learn early on in the service if there is a stop that is not utilized, or if there is an area that you're getting a lot of requests for deviations. So don't be afraid to make the modifications, but give it enough time to make sure that you have good information also. So I would suggest 6 months into the program, you should take a good hard look at what your data is saying and consider modifications at that time, and then every 6 months or so after that. Okay. That's what I have on the Wabash project. Rob, did you have any additional information you'd like to add?
Well, Julie, I think if we should let the audience know that Wabash, after we had completed this this evaluation and report, that there was some change in the personnel at Wabash. I believe they agreed on demand response service within the town of Wabash, but because of the staff turnaround and hiring new people, that they haven't been able to implement that. And that's accurate, right?
Yes, and I do continue to be in communication with Wabash, and they actually are on their third transit manager since we did this study. The goal is still to implement the service, and I believe that this transit manager has been there for a few months now, so I believe they probably are on some solid ground now that they can, again, start to move forward.
Okay.
They have submitted to the Indiana Department of Transportation and gotten consensus from the Indiana Department of Transportation that this is the most appropriate service mode for the area. So that piece has been taken care of.
Okay. Well, thanks, Julie, for your presentation. What I'm going to do is just switch the panels over to my screen. Our next presenter is Angie Peters. She's the Union County Public Transit Manager. What I have to do is, and you have to bear with me on this because I have to bring up Angie's slides. I'm not exactly sure. All right, well, I can't get rid of, oh, here we go. Okay. This is the behind the scenes part of webinars, of course. Okay, our next presenter is Angie Peters, and what Angie's going to do is she is a provider of service and does deviated fixed route, and give us an explanation of her experience with fixed route service. Angie?
Okay, so in Union County, a year and a half ago, we made the decision to transition over to deviated fixed route for our Saturday service. We're having an interesting issue where the Saturday service was extremely expensive to keep paratransit running alongside the fixed route without there being a utilization of the service. And as you can see, like over the years, the amount of paratransit calls that were happening on Saturdays were getting fewer and fewer, but the fixed route utilization was increasing, and we were in danger of losing that service altogether in order to meet our requirements through the ADA. So we switched over, and the fixed route utilization continued to grow. But what was really interesting was that there wasn't really an increase of the need for those rides that weren't exactly fixed route. We have a few people that in the beginning were kind of routinely using it, and that dwindled down. We noticed at about a year in that while the overall ridership for Saturdays was growing, the deviation requests were going down pretty significantly. So we re-advertised that it was a deviated route and the deviations were open to anyone, because there seemed to be some confusion for the general public that you didn't have to be a person who was paratransit eligible in order to make a route deviation. And since doing that advertising, we've actually seen an increase from where we would maybe get one deviation request every other month. We have gotten like 2 or 3 per month since doing that advertising campaign. I'm going to talk a little bit about policies, if you want to go to the next slide, Rob. Okay, so we set a scheduling window for anyone that was going to be doing a deviation because we weren't going to have that office staff on hand running paratransit. So we had them use our same day in advance parameters that we have for a paratransit system, which for us in Union County meant that they needed to call by 3 p.m. the day previous to get their deviation set up. And we did allow them to call and leave a message on Saturday if they were canceling a ride, so that the drivers could find out about it. As far as keeping the fixed route timely while deviating, as far as we chose to deviate, because we wanted to uphold the service area that we had for our paratransit, which was 3/4 of a mile, which can be excessive to keep the line running on time. So we allowed for the option if they wanted to go further than 1/4 of a mile from the fixed route to get picked up, to instead use an accessible van to go get them so that we could keep the route moving on time. And because they were scheduling a day in advance for that deviation, we then would know we needed another driver to be working on Saturday to accommodate them. We also had to make sure it was really clear to anyone that wanted to make a deviation how we were going to determine if they were falling in that area. Because typically when you communicate your service area to your passengers, you're showing them like a radius based off of your fixed route. And to determine where we would go for deviations, it had to be point by point navigating rather than radius. And so we need to make sure that was clear to every client that called in. And we had one client in particular that would fall outside of how far we were able to go to give them door-to-door service. So we were able to sort of meet them within the radius, and they had to travel further to get to it, which was not ideal, but was not the general theme with all of our people that use deviation. And then one of the big things to make sure it was clear to everybody that was not using Saturday service for deviations, but just riding in general, was that it wasn't going to negatively impact their service. So one thing that we do on our fixed route line pretty consistently around town is flag stops for boarding. And we had some people that were concerned that by switching to deviations, we would lose flag stops in order to remain timely, which we have not had to do. And making sure that, I think the biggest thing with making deviated route work when you're switching to it from a different service model is making sure that your ridership really understands what's going on, because it is not what a person typically thinks of when they think of public transportation. Next slide. And doubling back on the community outreach. So obviously we did community outreach when we initially launched Deviated Route, but we ended up having to go back about a year into the program and do that process over again, because we were noticing diminishing returns on people using it. And just with general conversation with our ridership, we discovered that there was a fairly large misunderstanding of how the program worked and who was eligible for it. So we had to kind of just go through with them again and explain that there was no limitation on who could make a deviation or a limit on how many deviations a passenger was able to make or where it would go to, as far as not prioritizing where a person may deviate to or not deviate to. And one of the biggest differences that we had to make clear, particularly for people who would normally be paratransit riders, was the difference in dwell time. So with paratransit, they're used to 2 to 5 minutes of waiting time with the driver for their scheduled pickup time. And on a deviated route, that's not possible. So that's not to say that they have a time limit on the amount of time that they can board the bus, but they have a time limit on the amount of time to present themselves for the ride. Because if we're coming to a stop and they're not there, we're not going to wait where we would wait if it was a typical paratransit service. I think that covers just about everything in the policies. If there are questions at the end, I could answer them.
Okay. Well, thank you, Angie. And just to let everybody know, Angie's policies are available as a download from the dashboard. Okay, I just have to switch over to our next presenter is Frank Thomas. And what Frank is going to do is give us some more examples about moving from a demand response type of service to a fixed route deviation service. Frank Thomas, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. My thanks to Rob and Liz and National RTAP and my fellow panelists for the opportunity to present. So this afternoon, I'm going to quickly share 3 route deviation concept projects from my region that are in varying states of development. I'll briefly touch on the characteristics of each community and their challenges so that you can get a feel for the flexibility of the delivery model. It'll also offer you some insights into the common impetus for modal changes within these communities, because there's a lot of common threads between them. And at the end, I'll leave you with a couple of resources to play with. Next slide, please. Our first community is Pendleton, Oregon. We're going to probably spend the most time here because, frankly, they've got the most work to do. It's home to 16,500 people and located in the northeast corner of Oregon. It's presently served by Kayak Public Transit, which is a service of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. It also features a taxi voucher program and several nonprofits who are serving their respective constituents. So it'll be like senior centers and veteran service groups and group homes for independent living. And there are some private for-profit Medicaid non-emergency medical transit providers in the community as well. The combined ride volume for the community is a little bit speculative on my part because the DOT does not fund all of the service providers. Annually, the city of Pendleton provides around 65,000 taxi voucher rides. Kayak's metro line delivers another 15,000 or so, and the balance is sort of an estimate based on the nonprofits that report to us that I could actually see. So for reasons that you'll see on the next slide, Pendleton's largest challenge is demand. They are my last and I think largest provider that still runs public mobility a little bit as an arm's length proposition. That is, the city finance director, who already had a full-time gig before she took on public transit, is our mobility lead, and she contracts everything that she does to the local taxi company for her voucher program. That's incredibly expensive because the limiting factor is how much time does the driver have. It doesn't really matter how large your vehicle is. You can only provide door-to-door service so fast. Demand in that model, at least if it's well-funded, is almost always going to grow to exceed the supply. The coping mechanism of least resistance is to ration the availability, so people can get X number of tickets a month, for example. When demand further grows and that approach fails, a lot of folks basically try to figure out how to prioritize within that ration. So the logic goes something like, maybe we provide tickets to seniors and people with disabilities first, and then whatever's left we'll make available on a first-come, first-served basis. What could be further from the spirit of our industry than that? I mean, it's scary how fast and how often a bottleneck can become a barrier. So while Pendleton is conceptually rough, it really took some leadership for them to explore another model to begin with. And I think that's the first common thread moving forward in all the systems that we're going to talk about, moving at least from demand response service to something that's more shared ride and more general public in nature. May I please have the next slide? Okay, what you see here is Kayak Public Transit's Mission Metro line. The left-hand side of the map is the city of Pendleton, and the right hand is the city of Mission, where tribal housing, healthcare, governance, and their enterprise zones exist. The more pale lines on the map indicate that the system uses different patterns at different times of the day. Next slide, please. The Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation is one of the largest employers in the area. So Kayak's Mission Metro line was originally designed to get people from the city of Pendleton to the tribal enterprise zones to go to work without turning the entire reservation into a big parking lot. Just looking at the map, you may wonder why the city of Pendleton would want to put up another route at all. I mean, from a 2,000-foot view, it looks like almost everything that really matters is already within a half a mile of a bus stop. Next slide, please. The reality is that true to its mission, the Metro line is it's relatively commuter friendly if you happen to work for the tribe. The published schedule here indicates that the travel corridor, the stops, and the schedule are different depending on the time of day that you travel. So there is meaningful service happening within the city of Pendleton, but it's sort of incidental to the intent of the system and the reason it was built to begin with. Next slide, please. So this is the city of Pendleton's first attempt at a bus line. Please note that there are stops that are nowhere near a route, and that is actually by intent. That's an indication that the city is beginning to realize the real power of route deviation. These are known demand centers that don't necessarily need to be routed. If they have the power to deviate, you can move off and serve these folks on an as-needed basis. To the city of Pendleton, the same day, on-demand flexibility that it would be consistent with what a holder of a taxi voucher program would experience is really important to the future of their program. Next slide, please. The city has placed very few stops in their downtown core, which is not as counterintuitive as you may initially think. They're making an intentional connection with the tribe on both sides of their downtown core that will hopefully help facilitate those stops via transfer and partnership with an existing service line. They're going to do their marketing and outreach, but it always helps if you can ride the coattails of a more experienced partner. Next slide, please. So editorially speaking, it seems like loops and circuits are sort of the default preference of almost every first-time system designer, and that included me 20 years ago. The data from demand response is often all you have to work with, so you tend to prioritize coverage. Routed service is a completely different animal. With experience, the emphasis on coverage that will often moderate as passengers, focus groups, and stakeholders demand more direct access, less time on board, and more frequent service. I anticipate that about half of the city of Pendleton stops will evolve into the off-route deviations that we talked about in an earlier slide, and that will result in a more streamlined service model with shorter headways. Next slide, please. So the next city we're going to take a look at is the city of John Day, population 1,744. It's located in the east central part of Oregon, and they're about 100 miles from the nearest interstate. In terms of being off the beaten path, they're about as far away as you can get. They're presently served by demand response dial-a-ride and intercity lines that connect to the surrounding larger communities. In the last couple of biennia, they've racked up between 30,000 and 35,000 annual boardings. Like our friends in Pendleton, the demand for local service is beginning to exceed capacity. But what makes John Day a little bit unique is they also have connectivity for the surrounding areas in mind. Next slide, please. John Day has a bit of a leg up on Pendleton insofar as they actually have a full-time transit manager who has experience in route design. What they've put together is a high-frequency line that leverages the size of the bus rather than being limited on how many rides can a driver possibly squeeze into an hour worth of time. Next slide, please. During off-peak demand cycles, they've built out connections to their bedroom communities, which I guess in the rural area they're in is sort of like moving out to the suburbs. So by doubling the length of the route and their headway, which still isn't a deal breaker, you're only looking at 8 miles and another 10 or 15 minutes per route. So by doubling that, they're able to triple their exposure to population and jobs within a half-mile radius of a bus stop. Next slide, please. So as we continue to zoom out, there are a couple of daily trips that they have on their itinerary that will serve more distant population centers for commuters and connections to the intercity bus lines that are keeping the community connected to the larger infrastructure of the state. Next slide, please. John Day represents a step up the preparedness scale from the first community we visited. They've got some direct experience with local commute patterns and travel sheds. They've done their homework, not that Pendleton hasn't, but they've just had more time in the game. There's a really clear priority to serve frequency in the travel dense areas and to accommodate the nearby populations during their off-peak hours. Incidentally, this is worth talking about. John Day was in the path of totality during the Great American Eclipse last year. They stood up one of rural Oregon's most ambitious event-driven systems I think I've seen in 2 decades in this gig. You're looking at a community that did probably 30,000 rides a year, and that weekend they did 1,000 rides in a couple of days. So the fingerprints of that planning effort and the partnerships that they developed are still heavily informing the concepts that they're moving forward with for their deviated system. Next slide, please. So our final stop in this whistle stop tour is the conjoined communities of Burns and Hines in Southeast Oregon. If you watched the news a couple of years ago and those radical people who were upset about something or other took over a federal bird sanctuary, that's where Burns and Hines are. So a community of less than 3,000 people regularly puts on over 10,000 rides per quarter, all demand response. Keeping up with demand is probably the most compelling reason for this community to step up their game. But because everything they've been doing is demand response, which is the most expensive and least efficient system of delivery possible, they're also very concerned with their ability to stay on budget and to continue to deliver high quality services. May I please have the next slide? So far, this route design is probably best in class in terms of rural Oregon route deviation concepts. Like our friends in Pendleton, there are pale lines on the map, and to the north, this represents an intentional partnership to serve the reservation of the Burns Paiute tribe. In the southern area of the map, that indicates that the route going in one direction will be slightly different than the route headed in the other direction. Next slide, please. So knowing that the route is intended to deviate, the transit manager has optimized her system for both coverage and schedule. She's also allowed a certain amount of recovery time at the end of each direction so that she doesn't end up with a situation where she's asked to make a deviation or has to make a deviation where the lift has to be deployed that results in her running behind schedule all day long. Next slide, please. This map demonstrates the partnership with the Burns Paiute tribe. The tribal transit system runs from 6 a.m. to 3 p.m., and the local service that they're marking up here is scheduled to run from 7 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. After 3 p.m., the route changes from the one that was on the earlier slide and it goes from a 60-minute headway to a 90-minute headway so that it can accommodate the tribal housing centers and the health center and the dense populations up to the north. It remains rider friendly because they've put a lot of thought into how they schedule their stops. They feature predictable time intervals, whether you're running at a 60 or 90-minute headway, and the community can catch on really quickly to the changes and how they benefit folks. Next slide, please. The route that they've marked up for Burns and Hines takes advantage of known travel patterns and schedules within the community and makes intentional connections to the partnering systems. Amongst those, obviously, this is an excellent example of how to engage our tribal partners and to make sure that we're leveraging what's best about each system. They've also made intentional connections to the Oregon Point system. Oregon Point is a contract service that we at DOT provide that sort of augments what Greyhound used to do before they pulled out of a lot of our smaller communities and creates some of that inter-community connectivity. Sorry, I lost my place. Where the Burns system really excels is in the development of a transit culture in rural communities. I mean, you just don't see that very often, where people, you can ask the average person in Burns and they'll say, yes, people like me ride the bus. That's why they're regularly knocking down, 12 annualized rides per capita or better. The resulting demand is basically what's compelled them into taking that next step up. So they're converting to a route deviation model from a position of strength, and also one of basically being fiscally conservative. A pilot project materially similar to what I've just shown you is intended to launch this summer. May I please have the next slide? The common takeaways from these communities are the need to scale up their existing transit systems. The route deviation model probably provides the best of urban efficiency that can be delivered on what is typically a more scant rural budget. Deviated route systems often recycle policy and planning that we've already done for our demand response systems. And because we're taking on something that looks like a fixed route, it helps us by putting things in front of us that will allow us to develop sorry, I lost my place, will allow us to develop full-scale fixed route and complementary paratransit delivery services. Another key takeaway is that the shortest route isn't necessarily the straightest. The community of Pendleton that I showed you first time and the last one in Burns have markedly different strategies in how they'll deliver services. In a couple of years, I think they're both likely to evolve toward each other and look pretty similar. It's important to remember that route deviation is about flexibility to respond to the passenger's known and changing needs. As a result, data collection, analysis, system modification, and then going right back to data collection, analysis, and system modification are really key to the first couple of years of service. These sorts of evolutions require a lot of care and feeding in the beginning. It's almost choreography between giving something enough time to gain awareness and staying connected to your service and your constituents that will allow you to evolve when the market says you should shift. In a couple of years, when we have enough data for a nice before and after snapshot of how these services performed, we're going to have a really robust catalog of best practices and lessons learned. So I hope you'll invite us back. A couple of quick caveats. The ADA doesn't take a vacation just because this particular mode doesn't require paratransit support. As long as you're providing public transit with federal money, you're always going to be on the hook for the cross-cutting requirements. Those include, but are by no means limited to, passenger assistance, including priority seating assistance, the functionality of your lift, ramp, and securement equipment, uniform delivery of applicable seatbelt laws and local policies, accommodating all passengers that your equipment will safely serve. You can't say X number of pounds chair and rider if they'll fit and they're within the weight of your equipment you have to serve. Standees and other lift and ramp accommodations, accommodation of service animals and personal care attendants, reasonable modification of your policies and rules. That's one of the things that our site reviews are coming back with now that we're in the second or third round. Reasonable modification is an important piece of your policy to have. and of course, having a formal ADA complaint and complaint resolution process. Well, it's not an explicit requirement of route deviation. It's my personal opinion that having your driver do stop announcements is not only a best practice, it's probably more important in route deviation than even fixed route, because clearly the fixed route's never going to leave the travel corridor. Finally, a quick caution about NTD, National Transit Database. In Oregon, we have a rural program coordinator at our Mill Creek office in Salem who's an expert at this stuff. I can call her and she knows it inside and out, but not everybody is so lucky. NTD, for the purpose of route deviation, can be a little tricky. Since route deviations tend to be rare, no matter how well you publicize them, just like Angie was saying in her presentation, National Transit Database wants route deviation to be tracked as if it were a fixed route. That doesn't affect your obligation to provide ADA paratransit. It's still demand response from the perspective of the Federal Transit Administration, but you'll have to be able to track it both ways so that at the end of the year you can provide the proper reporting. May I please have the next slide? Okay, so all of the remix maps from the content of this slideshow are available for you to download, study, and play with. The nice thing about Remix is you can take these links, download them into your system, and evaluate them, make changes, modify them, send them back to whoever made them, and you don't actually change the original map. In so doing, transit managers can actually use this to crowdsource the developments they're trying to figure out on route design before they ever launch something. So, you know, passengers and stakeholders and drivers can all take a look and tell you straight away, wow, that's not going to work. You really ought to try something else. And after you've gone through enough of those processes, you tend to come out with a pretty bulletproof project. It'll also do amazing things for, you know, Title VI analysis and limited English proficiency and population densities. It's a nice tool. If there's anything that I can do to assist you in your research, development, or delivery of route deviation, National RTAP has me through October, and even afterward, I'm always happy to provide technical assistance. I'm happiest when I'm helping the world become more inclusive and connected, actually. The QR code on this slide will get you to my LinkedIn profile, but honestly, it probably still says that I have Angie's job, and that's probably okay because she's a great resource too. Finally, shameless plug. Everything that you see in this slideshow that didn't come from Remix or didn't come from cooltext.com is available to you to use for free. It's at the National RTAP Marketing Toolkit, and the URL is included at the bottom. If you download this presentation, all of those URLs are also hyperlinked so they can get you directly to where you want to go. I don't really have a good end for this presentation, so I will stop and field questions, and you know, softballs are always appreciated.
Okay, thanks a lot, Frank. Very good presentation. We do have a number of questions, and I appreciate the folks that are sticking around. I realize that we've gone over an hour so far. I'm just going through them. I'm not sure, mainly because of when they came in. Some of them may be just all for Frank, but what I'm going to do is just start to ask them and then see where we go. Please explain taxi voucher program. I think Frankie made a reference to that.
So the city of Pendleton has a taxi voucher program where they use their resources to subsidize taxi tickets for people in their community. So let's say a one-way taxi ride, it costs you $8. You can go to the city office and for maybe $2 you can pick up a taxi ticket that will allow you to use the cab. And it's just sort of the way that, in the absence of another provider, demand response has evolved in their community.
Okay. And I think anybody can come in on this one too as well. For a route to be considered deviated, can the transit operator designate certain areas of the route as deviation areas or zones, so the entire route doesn't have to be deviated based? Anyone? Frank?
Okay, if nobody else is going to field it, then yes, I'll try. There are certain times when it makes sense that you wouldn't deviate. For example, in the city of Pendleton for the Mission Metro line that I showed you, there's a section of that line that goes down Interstate 84. You're clearly not going to deviate off of the interstate. So my guess would be you're going to want to check with your DOT locally, check with your subject matter expert on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and make sure that you're doing your due process. But if you've got a good reason why not to deviate, then I think there's probably latitude to make a reasonable call there.
Okay, thanks, Frank. This is just a comment, and I just want to thank whoever sent this. They just said that in addition to, hold on, this webinar is one of the best from FTA RTAP. In addition to rules and regulations needs, this route design information is really interesting and educational. Please do more of these. And I want to thank that person who.
Wow, thank you.
Okay. What's the minimum amount of deviation one must do to be ADA compliant?
Okay, if nobody else is going to field this one, I will. There isn't a minimum. Your route deviation system is considered a demand response system. So that's going to be designed within your local policy. Angie, what is your deviation corridor? Is it still 1/4 of a mile?
No, we've gone up to 3/4, but if we exceed 1/4, we reserve the right to send an accessible vehicle if that will be more timely.
And Frank, if I could add to that too, that again, the systems probably need to check with their state DOTs, because I do know that some of the state DOTs, if the deviations are at a minimal threshold, then they want the system then to basically change to fixed route service. They're saying that unless you have a minimum number of deviations, then you are not operating a deviated route service.
And when you get to the point where your schedule dictates that you don't have time to deviate, then I totally concur with you. You're operating a fixed route at that point. Congratulations. Right?
Okay, and thank you, the three of you, for responding to that question. We have a comment here. What do you mean RTAP has you until October? I can answer that. Frank is a National RTAP Review Board member, and for folks that are a Review Board member, they have a 3-year commitment to be on the Review Board, and Frank is coming up to the end of his 3rd year come October. Although we always try to utilize our Review Board members even after they're no longer with us, and even come back after a couple of years in the event that any people who have been nominated to be Review Board members, that we don't have many people coming in and we need more. So Frank could come back, which would be very enjoyable. He is a great Review Board member.
May I please follow up on that real quickly?
Go ahead.
If there's anyone who has interest in serving on the National RTAP Review Board, it's been one of the great privileges of my life. They do roll over members every 3 years, so there's always an opportunity. They're frequently looking for new members. Respond to that solicitation. Get involved. This is one of the best organizations you'll ever have the opportunity to work with. Everyone in this group is operating a rural system. You don't have to scale the answers you receive from urban partners into your market. You can put their information to work right away. And my guess is if you've been doing this longer than a year or two, you have something of value to contribute.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, this goes to you. Would you please repeat and/or elaborate on tricky NTD reporting?
Oh, yeah, sure. So National Transit Database considers the route deviation mode to be fixed route. And the reason they do that is because, as Angie pointed out earlier, your requests to deviate, no matter how well you publicize, are going to be relatively infrequent. Yeah, most of, probably 90% or better of the rides that you deliver are going to be people who show up along the published corridor. So NTD wants to see this as fixed route. Now, for Federal Transit Administration and the way that you probably report to your DOT on a quarterly basis, this is still demand response. It's not fixed route. And you'll probably want to check in with your local ADA person on why that's important. But the key takeaway is if you deliver a fixed route system, you have a civil right obligation to support it with ADA complementary paratransit. Route deviation is demand response, not fixed route, but NTD still wants it reported as a fixed route. So it's just a matter of making sure that you're tracking your data both ways so that you can deliver an accurate response to whichever reporting audience happens to be asking for it.
Okay, thank you, Frank.
And can I also throw in there too about some other state DOTs have made some modifications for their reporting based upon the NTD data, and now are having systems report demand response, deviated route, and fixed route on the monthly reports or quarterly reports that are being reported to the state DOT. So that does simplify things a little bit for those operating a deviated route service.
You know, we have a really smart NTD and rural program manager in our office in Salem. I'll check in with her after this and see if that might make some sense for us as well.
Just a comment from me, Rob. I believe that we're doing an NTD webinar at some point, probably within the next 6 months or so. Maybe we can include that as part of the presentation, just some clarification on reporting deviated route. I do have a question here, but I'm not really sure, and I kind of understand how some things get misspelled because of phones. That was me in rural Wisconsin with the route design comment. I'm not sure whether it's newer transit manager who inherited an SM systems, they could use change. I'm not sure. Maybe if the
Rob,
person
that was just someone saying that she had asked the previous question.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry.
Sorry, Rob, is that a question?
Hold on. I'm getting.
Or is that a request for?
I just have a very small screen. Let's see, change. Really do more of these route design webinars. All are. Oh,
Rob, you can expand it. You can expand the question box.
I got it. Just did it. Okay.
Got it. It's helpful.
And I think you just got a great thank you, Liz, for straightening me out. Profiles. We did have somebody say not able to locate links and profiles. What we'll do for that person is we'll send you an email with, in order for you to access what you're trying to do, okay? Because we do have your information because you signed in. And then, another person for Liz, it's Elizabeth Taylor. You may be familiar with the name. And Liz is our Assistant Executive Director for National RTAP. And she's located in Woburn, Massachusetts. And she does a great job, and she keeps me on track. And I think that that's it for our questions. And we are coming up to an hour and a half. I do want to thank the audience for sticking around. We had a pretty good number. What I'm trying to do is get back to another screen that I had, because I was hoping to at least show you. Oh, here we go. I wanted to get to the presenters just one more time, just to let you know who the folks were that presented. Once again, we have Julie Schafer. She's a senior associate at RLS and Associates. Angie Peters, she's with the Union County Public Transit Manager there. And Frank Thomas, he's with the Oregon DOT Region 5 Coordinator for Rail and Public Transit. I want to thank the three of them for their presentation. I agree with the questions that we had, stating that it was a nice webinar, and I appreciate that our presenters came in with some great presentations about deviated route, and that it is a type of system that seems to be growing with popularity. Thank you all. This was a National RTAP webinar. I usually have a last screen with information about National RTAP, but of course I didn't put it in there. But if you are interested in anything on National RTAP, you can go to our website at nationalrtap.org. If in the event that you're interested in the recording of this particular webinar, the slides, the transcript from the recording, this is the information that that you need in order to get that information. And once again, I want to thank our panelists, Julie, Angie, and Frank, for doing a great job, and the attendees for joining this webinar. And I hope you all have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.